Today we will take a look at Reconstruction, 1863 to 1877, remaking America in the aftermath of the Civil War. Our objectives are to identify key people and events, understand the legal framework of Reconstruction, examine Southern reactions to new ethnic relations, and describe African American post-slavery community building. We will begin by reviewing antebellum political conflicts. Keep in mind that prior to 1861, much of the political debate within the country revolved around strict construction versus loose construction of the U.S. Constitution. There were those that wanted a very strict interpretation of the United States federal government, and they wanted to place most of the powers within that of the states. And this worked very well, especially for agrarian societies whose interests were mostly in the local production of staple commodities. They did not necessarily need heavy industry. They did not need extensive transportation networks. And as such, many of their local funding efforts, as well as state funding efforts, were able to meet their economic needs. Much of the support of this type of interpretation of the Constitution could be found throughout the southern states as well as many of the western states. However, much of the northeastern country had begun to industrialize, and so instead they desired a more loose interpretation of the Constitution that would give the federal government some leeway and some power to assist states in the development of infrastructure projects that local communities could not necessarily undertake on their own. Another major sticking point was that of the 3/5 clause. When the framers of the Constitution decided to agree to the Great Compromise, they included a portion within the United States Constitution that allowed slaveholding states to count slaves as 3/5 of the population whenever determining apportionment to Congress. And what this basically did is it gave southern states a larger representation in Congress than what they would have had if they would have only counted free citizens within their own borders. In essence, this basically gave the southern states southern political dominance within the House of Representatives throughout the 1860s and the late 1700s. Add to this the balance within the Senate and the fact that most presidents prior to the American Civil War were chosen from the South. This meant that the southern states basically chose the political agenda for the nation as a whole. And much of their agenda was very agrarian based. It was based on the protection of slavery. And it was not one that usually met the needs of the northern states. So a lot of these arguments were over things such as internal improvements. They were over Congress's power to raise taxes, to raise tariffs, and then to even use the revenue from those tariffs and taxes in supporting internal improvements and economic development. So there was a lot of division here. Now, in addition to that, there was a major division over slave societies versus free labor societies in the United States of America. Most of the free labor societies were found throughout the northern states. Here, the economies and their communities were based on small farms, usually family-owned. They produced a lot of goods for local consumption as well as some for export. But free labor especially was useful in the industrialization of the northern part of the country. Instead of most of the money of families being tied up in the land, they were able to take money and invest it in industry. They were able to invest it in community, invest it in education, develop the skills necessary for the new economy that was emerging as a result of the British Industrial Revolution. Compare this to the slave society of the South. In the slave society of the South, the majority of the wealth and the political power was concentrated at the very top of their societies. Most of the wealth was sunk into land as well as slaves. They had very little in the way of internal improvements, very little in the way of investment in education. And so what you really had is a dual society there. You had the very privileged, wealthy Southern elite at the very top that basically dictated to the rest of society. Underneath of them, within the citizenship, you had the majority of the people, which tended to be poor white farmers. And then you had this entirely separated group, the slaves, who had no power, no citizenship, no protection whatsoever. And so one thing that the free labor societies disliked is they disliked having to compete with these southern states, especially in a political system that they view was rigged against them. Whereas they needed to be able to pull their efforts together through the federal government in order to build canals and to build railroads and national roads and develop harbors, southern states didn't need this. And so as long as the southern states were able to deny that to the northern states, they were able to deny the northern states the tools that they needed in order to really, fulfill their economic vision of the future. So this, of course, doesn't bring into the issue of the morality of slavery. Throughout the American North, many people had come to embrace what was called anti-slavery politics. They did not necessarily want equality with African Americans on the one hand, but on the other hand, they did view slavery in and of itself as immoral. And so they did not like having this system necessarily within their country. And all of these arguments, all of these fights became even more embittered through Western expansion. As new states opened up, as new territories opened up for settlement, southern states believed that it was vital to their survival to expand into them, to maintain that balance in the Senate, to maintain dominance within the House of Representatives. In other words, to retain their control over the United States federal government. The free labor states, on the other hand, did not want to see an extension of slavery, as they saw it as an antithesis to their American values, as they were getting tired of constantly having to compete with this, as well as being tired of having to deal with the southern states who had that inflated political power based on the 3/5 clause. So the American Civil War was basically the fight to resolve all of these issues. And the very beginning of the American Civil War was touch and go for the North. But going into 1863, the tides of war changed, especially with the Battle of Gettysburg and the fall of Vicksburg, with the opening or the capturing of the Mississippi River, the southern Mississippi River, by the Union naval forces. So in 1863, the federal government under the leadership of President Abraham Lincoln had to decide how exactly they were going to reconstruct the country, to rebuild it, in the aftermath of such a bitter American Civil War that was costing hundreds of thousands of lives. Now, Abraham Lincoln was a complicated individual. At first he approached the Civil War with the hope that he could negotiate an end to it, that he could limit the fighting. As the American Civil War continued on, though, he began to realize that peace through negotiation was not a possibility, that instead it would take a decisive battle to bring the southern states back into the conflict. Whereas he began the American Civil War as a president that didn't necessarily want to touch slavery if he didn't have to. By 1862, he had come to the firm conviction that the question of slavery had to be resolved. Otherwise, another war was destined for the future of the United States of America. So he realized that it was going to be a bitter fight. He did realize that it was going to take an end to slavery. He understood that the southern states would have to make changes, deep changes, to their society that was built and founded and framed around the institution of slavery. But one thing that he wanted to do was to do it without bitterness, without inflaming passions as they already stood. He wanted, in essence, after the war, to immediately begin the healing process and to bring the country back together in a spirit of harmony. And so to this end, in December 8th, 1863, he issued what was known as his Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction, often referred to as the 10% Plan. And basically what this policy did was grant amnesty to all individuals involved in armed insurrection against the federal government, the restoration of all property with the exception of slaves, after the property owners swore allegiance to the United States of America. And once 10% of the 1860 population within a state had sworn allegiance, they could reform their state government, appeal to the Lincoln administration for reinstatement, and then once again regain their statehood status. So it was a way, on the one hand, of saying, okay, we're not going to put a lot of restrictions on you. We're not going to drag this process out longer than it needs to be, but you are not going to be allowed to regain your slaves. We're not going to hold you accountable. We're not going to throw you in jail if you fought for the southern states. But on the other hand, you are going to recognize that slavery ends with your defeat. And we can see all of these impulses within Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address. In his second inaugural address, a couple paragraphs that I've chosen to look to are as follows. He said, and I quote, "If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which in the providence of God must needs come, but which having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war, as the woe due to those by whom the offense came, shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes, which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn by the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgment of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us, to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." While the sentiment was beautifully spoken, it did not necessarily win over all of the North. Many people had decided that the southern states, having committed a crime of treason by taking up arms against the lawfully elected government of the United States, they believed that the leaders of the southern states of the Confederacy needed to pay potential, especially criminal charges for betraying the United States government. They believed that African Americans should be empowered to vote with political rights, that they should be given some economic assistance in developing a foundation to guarantee their education and their freedom afterwards, and that the leadership of the Confederacy and those politicians that voted on secession, on treason, should essentially have to pay a penalty of never having a role in government again to prevent this from happening again. So to that end, the radical Republicans, so those that were, the far end of the spectrum when it comes to these views, they passed what was known as the Wade-Davis Bill on July 2nd, 1864. And what they said was that, first off, there would be a longer process of Reconstruction. There would be, guarantees that slavery was going to end. But on top of that, only individuals who could swear an ironclad oath that they had never supported secession or armed insurrection would be able to have that right to vote. And it was only once they had enough people that could swear this ironclad oath that they would be readmitted to the Union as full states. And again, this was to guarantee that no supporters of the Confederacy would be able to revive their political power. So what basically happened between these two views, these two visions of Reconstruction, was that it was an impasse. The Wade-Davis bill passed both houses of Congress, but Lincoln ended up pocket vetoing the bill by refusing to sign it formally or to veto it before Congress adjourned. So it ends at a stalemate. But one thing that did happen in 1864 that both sides agreed on was that the 13th Amendment moved forward. And what the 13th Amendment did essentially was to end slavery in the United States of America. And it did so with a very basic structure in its writing. When it was first off, it wasn't able to get enough votes to pass in 1864, although it starts moving around Washington D.C. at this time. But it does pass the end of January of 1865, and it says very simply that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, wherever the parties shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So basically, the radical Republicans believed that this was going to be, put an end to any such status of slavery in the future. Now, one thing to understand, though, is that the phrasing of this, the language that they used, did open up a loophole that would be used by the Southern states throughout much of the late 1800s and into the 1900s to basically reinstate a form of slavery, and that is this phrase right here. What the Southern states would basically end up doing is they would say, okay, we're going to pass a series of laws that takes minor infractions and puts hefty prison sentences on people, and of course the target of these laws were African Americans. And then once found guilty of a crime, they would be placed on what were known as chain gangs, where they could be forced to go and build roads and build the Southern infrastructure, or they were oftentimes also contracted out as free labor to businesses. Now, another thing that the radical Republicans did was they created an organization known as the Freedmen's Bureau in March 3rd of 1865. And what the Freedmen's Bureau did is it created a federal institution that would essentially help African Americans build community following the conclusion of the American Civil War. So what all did it do exactly? Well, it sent down certified teachers, trained teachers into the Southern states to help train African Americans as teachers so that they could start schools. And African Americans were very much interested in this. Keep in mind they'd always been denied that right to read, and they quickly grasped it. And so some of the schools that we saw built with great frequency after the American Civil War were schools that served African American communities. So education was a major cornerstone of the Freedmen's Bureau. Another thing that the Freedmen's Bureau did is it tried to help African Americans reunite, or freed slaves reunite with their family members. Back in around the 1960s, there used to be this view within society that slavery destroyed the African American family. This used to be a theory that was embraced by social scientists and historians and others. And today we understand, based on the historical record and documents, testimonials left behind, statistics, you name it, that slavery did not destroy the family, the African American family. If anything, it made it even more valuable to them. We can see this on slave plantations when slaves would risk, horrible punishments to escape for just even a little while if they lived on another plantation, to go and visit family members and wives. After the American Civil War, African Americans went out looking for lost relatives, trying to reunite them. And the Freedmen's Bureau, it did try to help to this end. It also helped to guarantee that local Southern communities could not try to use the law to restrict their freedom and their movement. They offered employment protection for freed African Americans, helping them find a job. And one thing that the Freedmen's Bureau would end up embracing was that they would embrace the concept of what was called 40 acres and a mule. So this was actually a program started by some, what are sometimes termed as like rogue Civil War generals. Generals that were down there in the South. They did not like the Southern cause. They did not like the fact that Southern plantation owners were taking up arms against their country. And so what did they do is they said, well, hey, since you are a traitor to the country, I'm just going to take your property and I'm going to redistribute it to your slaves. And so there were a number of generals that experimented with this, and the Freedmen's Bureau afterwards basically said, hey, let's pick up on this idea as a way of giving freed African Americans an economic foundation to build their communities on. So there were a lot of things that the Freedmen's Bureau was doing. But keep in mind, it was not the Freedmen's Bureau building African American community. It was Southern African Americans building their own communities and making use of the Freedmen's Bureau and the services that they offered. Now, Reconstruction struggles really picked up following Abraham Lincoln's assassination at Ford's Theater on April 14th, 1865. To build a bridge with Democrats in the North during the American Civil War, he turned to a Tennessean Democrat by the name of Andrew Johnson as his running mate. And Andrew Johnson, on the one hand, he disapproved of secession. He did not like plantation owners. He did not, he despised the slave-owning elite of the southern states. Growing up, he constantly saw them as using their wealth and privilege to keep, middle-class and poor white farmers down. Other than that, though, he was a fervent Jacksonian Democrat. He was an avid follower of states' rights. He himself was a previous slave owner, and he completely rejected the idea of racial equality, especially in the South. For him, the only proper Southern government was one that had whites with all of the power. So what he did is he basically tried to take Abraham Lincoln's 10% plan and use it as a foundation for Reconstruction. Basically to use it as a way of reconstructing the South without overturning ethnic relations. So what he did on May 29, 1865, is he issued a general amnesty to all Southerners who took an oath of allegiance. They would regain all confiscated property with the exception of slaves and all political rights. However, he did not extend this to property owners of $20,000 or more in assets, nor did he extend it to high-ranking Confederate leaders and politicians. So here kind of is the ego and the vanity, if you will, and the kind of vindictiveness of Andrew Johnson coming through. It's not that he was saying that they wouldn't get it. What he was saying is, okay, for you folks, you have to come to me personally and ask for it. So he basically wants them to come and beg. But ultimately, there was nothing, in his makeup that said that he wouldn't grant it to them if they came and made that personal appeal. And on the exact same day that he did this, he summoned North Carolina to summon delegates for a constitutional convention and begin the process of applying for statehood. So what happens? The Southern response was very quick. They quickly changed from hostility to Johnson as a successor of Abraham Lincoln to approval of him, and they began to reassert control. Ex-Confederate politicians and generals in those areas that had just been defeated were reelected to office, including the Confederate States of America Vice President Andrew Stevens. He was elected to Congress, one of the individuals that led this fight against the legitimate government of the United States of America. They immediately began the suppression of freedmen's and also freed women's rights in the South by passing what became known as black codes. These laws basically controlled movement. You had to oftentimes have a pass or a reason, just as you did when you were a slave, to move about the countryside. African Americans had to be considered gainfully employed, or they could be arrested. They could be forced to work for a plantation owner, even their former plantation owner. African American children could be taken away from their parents, and they could be apprenticed to a plantation owner until they were 18 or 21 years old. They were denied the right to assemble, denied the right to live in towns, denied the right to arm themselves, just denied. And so it was basically creating the segregated society with Euro-Americans on top, with African Americans basically stripped of all political power. So what was the response of Congress? Well, the radical Republicans reacted. They said, no, we fought an American Civil War against a group of people that decided that they did not like the outcome of a presidential election, and so they tried to turn their back on the Constitution to create their own country, and they started a war by firing on Fort Sumter in the process that led to 600,000 casualties or deaths in the United States of America. So they were not going to do this. So one thing that the fight really starts with the Freedmen's Bureau. They viewed this as a very successful program and a cornerstone to Southern Reconstruction by guaranteeing African Americans freedom and independence. So 1866, they needed to extend the Freedom's Bureau, and what did Johnson do is he stepped in and he tried to block extension of it. Right off the bat, he tried to block any measure, any effort to redistribute seized plantations and redistribute them to African Americans, even demanding that confiscated lands be taken from African Americans and returned to their previous property owner, regardless of whether or not that property owner took up arms against the United States. In 1866, he vetoed the Civil Rights Act, which was the first attempt by Congress to pass a law that guaranteed the rights of African Americans. So what happened? Well, the radical Republicans, they united and they started to try to find ways to rein in Johnson's obstruction of Reconstruction. And two of the most successful ways that they were able to do this was by passing amendments, the 14th and the 15th Amendments. 14th Amendment, basically what did it do is it went in and said that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens. So it granted them citizenship. And it said, okay, no state can abridge these privileges and immunities. They cannot deprive a person of life, liberty, or property without due process. So even in today's society, this 14th Amendment is essential when it comes to substantive due process within our court system, both criminal and civil. So an essential amendment today. What else did it do? Is it went through and it said, okay, we're going to guarantee that African Americans have the right to vote. So some of the key phrasings in this part here is, they're going back and saying, okay, we're apportioning states, based on the count of whole people, no more of this 3/5 stuff. And that says here, but when the right to vote at any election for the choice of electors for president and vice president of the United States, representatives in Congress, the executive and judicial officers of a state, or the members of the state legislature thereof, is denied to any of the male inhabitants of such state, being 21 years of age and so to citizens, or any way abridged, except for participation in rebellion or other crime, the basis of representation shall be reduced in the proportion of those people that were denied that right. So in other words, it says, okay, if this is the population of voters that we recognize based on, the first section of the 14th Amendment, and you go through with your laws in the southern states and try to reduce, this whole group's ability to vote, you're going to lose a similar amount of representation in Congress. Now, it continued on after that, and here it basically said, look, anybody that fought an insurrection, you're not going to serve in Congress again. So it prohibited them. And then it also went through and just basically said we're not paying the southern states' debts, that they incurred during the war, the Civil War. And then it said Congress has the right to basically enforce these acts. And then what they're going to do later on, this is in 1870, is they'll come back and they'll say, okay, just for good measure, we're going to guarantee that you guys, understood the first time that the right of citizens cannot be denied or abridged based on race, color, previous condition of servitude. So, this is to try and outlaw a lot of those what became known as grandfather clauses. Now, in addition to these amendments, they also passed what were known as the Reconstruction Acts of 1867. This is a series of acts that basically stripped former Confederates of their right to vote and hold office, and it declared all Southern governments then existing as provisional. It divided the South into 5 military districts, where the U.S. military would go down there and guarantee law and order and protect the rights of freedmen and women as well as Republicans living in those states. It demanded that all Southern states accept the 14th Amendment before they could rejoin. And it said that generals and military districts were responsible for registering eligible voters to send delegates to constitutional conventions prior to readmission. So this was to, again, give another safeguard and make sure that Reconstruction was properly followed along. Now, in 1868, they would also go through and pass a fourth Reconstruction Act of 1868, basically making sure that Southerners could not resist this process by boycotting elections for constitutional conventions. So this deals with like the legislative aspect. This is like the blueprint, if you will, the blueprint. Now, for Johnson, and it's also to kind of rein in Johnson. But with Johnson, they also needed some other safeguards, and one was the Tenure of Office Act. What they did is they wanted to make sure that they had people in the executive branch that were sympathetic to the Republican Party, that would continue on with, Lincoln's history of working with radical Republicans. And so basically what it did is it said, okay, the president cannot just simply fire the heads of cabinets, of executive departments. What basically happened is that it makes the Senate a part of the process required for dismissal of cabinet officers, as well as for the nomination and appointment of new ones. So it gave the Senate just that much of a greater check over the process of firing the heads of executive departments. After they did that, they passed a rider to an appropriations bill that basically said that all presidential orders to the Army must be issued through the General of the Army, who at this time was Ulysses S. Grant, who, by the way, could not be removed without the Senate's consent. So this basically is intending to box Johnson in. He has to keep Lincoln's people in office that are in his cabinet that are sympathetic to the radical Republican cause. And he can't, do an end run around the Reconstruction Acts by sidelining Ulysses Grant, because he has to send everything through Grant, who is, again, sympathetic to the radical Republican cause, and he can't remove Grant. So what happens? Well, again, Johnson continues to defy Reconstruction. He had his Attorney General, Henry Stanberry, basically go through and issue a report on the Reconstruction Acts that very, very, very narrowly interpreted it. So here he's trying to use his executive powers to strip the Reconstruction Acts of teeth. But then after that, he did, basically try for a showdown with the Senate. His initial efforts to resist Reconstruction, brought up a lot of debate and discussion within Congress about impeaching him. But this first effort failed because they didn't have any real substantive charges other than political disagreements with the president. So what Johnson does is, now that he's emboldened, he decides, okay, well, I'm just going to straight up pick a fight. And he attempted to dismiss and remove Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton from his position. And it ended with Secretary of Edwin M. Stanton basically barricading himself in his office after Johnson tried to replace him with Adjutant General Lorenzo Thomas, someone that was viewed as more sympathetic to Johnson. So this was the last straw, and on February 24th, 1868, the House brought up a series of articles of impeachment. So the first 8 articles directly involved the Stanton incident. There was a 9th article of impeachment for violating the congressional resolution of all orders having to pass through through Grant, because Johnson had tried to send orders directly to generals below Grant. There was a 10th article for strict defiance of Congress, and then there was an 11th article, and basically it drew all the other articles together into one impeachment. And so this went up to the Senate. The Senate held trial. And at the end of the day, basically what happened is it failed by only 1 vote. I mean, they did have the grounds to impeach him. But you had 7 moderate Republicans who believed, okay, if we do this, it's going to set a precedent of Congress removing a president just because he tries to use his political powers to push back against Congress, which they viewed this as just a part, although sometimes a very bitter part, but a part of their system of checks and balances. So these 7 people voted against it and it ended up failing by 1 vote. But this sent all the message that it needed to Andrew Johnson at this point. And from that point on, he just basically sat in office and rubber stamped everything that the Congress wanted. Now, he was replaced by President Ulysses S. Grant in the election of 1868. And so 1868 is a crucial year. 1868, all states, with the exception of Texas, Mississippi, Georgia, and Virginia, had been readmitted. They had outlawed slavery. They had accepted, the 13th and 14th Amendments. They had created new constitutions that were the product of cooperation between Euro-American and African-American Republicans and Unionists. They had African Americans, sitting in their state legislatures. And they were passing some of the most progressive fundamental laws that Southern states had ever seen. They had a public school system, a true public school system for once that was open to whites and blacks. They had started prison reforms. They had reduced the number of crimes eligible for capital punishment, so you couldn't just get hanged for doing the littlest thing anymore. They were starting to develop some limited social welfare programs. They had a property tax. They had universal manhood suffrage. So there were a lot of positive things happening in many of the southern states. But again, there was still some resistance to this. And this is one thing that President Ulysses S. Grant would have to fight against throughout much of his presidency. One of the biggest challenges he faced was white Southern violence and terrorism. Around 1866, you had two organizations, the Ku Klux Klan, the Knights of the White Camellia, that were organized for the basic principle of terrorizing African Americans, terrorizing Southern Republicans, and anybody else that did not fit this, this ethnic model that many white Southerners, that were prone to this persuasion, viewed. This idea that you had to be a white Protestant to have, freedom and equality, in the South. That's what they believed. So anybody that challenged that, anybody that spoke up for African Americans, anybody that voted Republican, Jews, Catholics, women's suffragists, anybody that went against that old white Protestant, Southern domination, was targeted by these groups. And it was a very hierarchical organization, we believe, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Nathan Bedford Forrest, a former cavalry officer of the Confederate Army, served as the Grand Wizard. And basically what did they do? Well, they used hit-and-run methods to terrorize, blacks who were attending school or voting, or whites supporting Reconstruction. So, coming in the dead of night, for example, and doing this cowardly act of attacking a man's family because he had dared to vote or demand an equal day's pay, setting fire to crops or barns, lynching human beings without a trial, without charges or anything, beating people. This was the action of these people. And the violence was extreme. So if you look at just the 1868 election, there were over 200 political murders in Arkansas alone. From April to November of that year, over 1,000 people murdered, most of them African Americans, for doing nothing other than exercising their rights as human beings, determine their own fate and destiny. So needless to say, the Grant administration, with the support of the Radical Republicans, decided to act. And the Radical Republicans passed the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1861. And what they did is they made it a felony for persons to interfere with voting and, to engage in these kinds of activity. And they authorized Grant to suspend the writ of habeas corpus in regions he deemed as in rebellion. They allowed him in the court system to remove jury members who were suspected of Klansmen, because one of the problems prior to the Ku Klux Klan Act is you could go out and arrest, people you knew were doing this, but then you would have this problem of jury nullification, where their buddies sitting on the jury would just straight up refuse to convict them. So that's what Grant does. He ordered his Attorney General, Amos Ackerman, to vigorously enforce the Ku Klux Klan Act. They had detectives go down there and infiltrate the Klan. They had federal marshals go out and arrest the ringleaders and people that they knew were guilty. They sent the cavalry into the South to back them up. When necessary, they suspended the writ of habeas corpus. And within a few years of this legislation, the Grant administration had basically broken the back of the Klan in the South. And it did not reemerge to the level of power that it had until really about the 1920s, when the southern states were so deeply into Jim Crow segregated society that it became basically a badge of honor for white businessmen and politicians and community leaders to be members of the Klan. Now, the last thing that happened in the 1870s, is that Congress did finally pass the Civil Rights Act, which was, really a dream for many of the radical Republicans who by now are ending their careers. They wanted a civil rights law that would, fully put the federal government's support behind African Americans' rights. The problem is that they had grown so weak in support, in the nation as Reconstruction dragged on and as their numbers in Congress dwindled, that the bill, by the time it cleared both houses, was a fragment of its former self. It did prohibit discrimination against blacks in transportation and public facilities, but it was up to African Americans to sue in a court of law when such instances occurred. And moreover, provisions to prevent segregation in educational facilities had been removed, along with other provisions giving the Civil Rights Act some teeth. So basically what it did is it said, okay, Southern African Americans, you have all these rights, but it's up to you to enforce it. You have to take the law to the states and whoever else to court. And of course, in a judicial system where money hires talent in the form of attorneys, that is where money is needed in order to actually prosecute a case against somebody. This basically meant that African Americans were on their own. Were on their own judicially. Now, some other aspects of foreign Reconstruction society, if we take a look first off at foreign affairs, there were some major watersheds in foreign affairs. First of all, there was a lot of talk of annexing Cuba, of purchasing it from Spain. Cuba had long since been a territory coveted by many Americans, especially Southerners, as a place where plantation agriculture could be extended. Americans had a lot of business ties in Cuba. In fact, they would retain a lot of these business ties up until the communist revolution under Castro and Guevara. But this didn't really go very far. It didn't produce anything. In terms of Great Britain, there was a lot of negotiation with Great Britain that eventually produces the Treaty of Washington in 1871. And one of the major issues that the United States of America had with Great Britain was the fact that Great Britain did act as the Southern armory throughout much of the American Revolution or Civil War. They supplied the South with warships. They supplied the South with weapons. There was a period when the British government was playing with the idea of intervening and recognizing the South as a separate country because they wanted access to the cheap cotton that Southern states produced. But the only thing that kept the British from doing this was the fact that they had taken a moral stance on slavery as early as 1832 when they outlawed it from all of its territories. And so by 1861-62, they were toying with the idea, but by 1863, after Gettysburg and Vicksburg falls, two major events, Britain realizes, okay, there's no way we can support it, and then they finally, backed off. But what's going to happen is in the Treaty of Washington is Great Britain formally apologized for their role in the Civil War, and they agreed to $15.5 million in restitution. And then in 1867, William H. Seward, Secretary of State, purchased Alaska, our first non-contiguous territory. And a lot of people initially viewed it as, they nicknamed it Seward's Folly because they thought it was just a bunch of ice. But with the Yukon Gold Rush, quickly people realized that no, Alaska, this really extensive territory, held a lot of natural resources. This was a period of also of great corruption within Congress. The American Civil War had expanded the power of the federal government, especially its ability to support businesses in the war effort. Congress at this time was doing a lot in western states. helping businesses open up new railroad lines, helping states form land grant colleges, passing laws that opened up new lands for mining interests and for farmers and homesteaders. And so there were a lot of people that, saw an opportunity to line their own pockets in this. So this is the beginning of what we nickname as the Gilded Age, in the 1870s into the late 1800s. A period that on the one hand, it looks all bright and shiny, like everything was great, but within there was a lot of problems in society, and one of which was corruption in politics. So, in many Western states, for example, some states like Nebraska, you had these state legislatures that would basically be elected and bought and paid for by railroad companies. And the whole purpose of buying these state legislatures was to monopolize land that they can then jack up the price on when they turn around to sell it to farmers, to prevent farmers from coming together and stopping any sort of predatory pricing of railroad fares. So there was corruption in many of the state legislatures, but then even in the federal government as well. You had cronyism, where politicians would go in and hire their buddies and give them lucrative government positions and contracts. You had nepotism, where they would basically do the same thing with family members. Within the southern states, this is the time period of the scalawags and the carpetbaggers. Scalawags were Southerners that worked with Republican administrations, and carpetbaggers were Northerners who came down to invest in the southern states and to try to get a foot into government. And the Southerners believed that the scalawags and the carpetbaggers, as well as African American riots, were causing all these problems and destroying this old Southern way of life. Through industrialization and the extension of railroads and road networks and schools and all that. So there was a lot of debate over the role of Northerners who were, becoming transplanted Southerners. And one of the major scandals to break in this time period was the Credit Mobilier scandal of 1868. The Credit Mobilier was a supply company created by some of the board members of the Union Pacific Railroad that were, racing against the Central Pacific in the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. And basically what the Union Pacific directors and high-ranking management were doing is they were awarding credit contracts to this company known as Credit Mobilier. And basically it was really just another company of which they were the directors. And so what they would do is the contracts would purchase supplies at inflated rates from the Union Pacific would issue these contracts purchasing supplies from Credit Mobilier at greatly inflated rates. And these contracts were usually being supported and funded by Congress or by shares sold to prominent congressmen. So it was a way of just basically funneling federal funds directly into the pockets of the board directors, and then using these ill-gotten gains to pay off congressmen in the process. And when a New York newspaper exposed the affair, the public was absolutely enraged. And during the process of the exposure, they came to find out that a lot of people in the Grant administration had ties to this. And so today, when we look at President Grant's presidency, we do see it as riddled with corruption. Now, did this necessarily make President Grant a corrupt individual? The answer there is no. But as far as being a president wise enough to understand who he was nominating to positions, this does leave quite a bit of a mar on his political legacy. Now, another major economic event of the Reconstruction era was the Panic of 1873 that started around the Northern Pacific Railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad was finished when the Central Pacific and Union Pacific lines met at Promontory Point May 10th, 1869. And their success spurred a massive nationwide effort at not just simply building transcontinental roads, but also feeder lines from these railroads to these newly opening territories. And one individual that was a company that got in on this was the Northern Pacific Railroad Company, whose financial affairs were controlled by a major financier of the time period, J. Cook of Philadelphia. And to fund the construction of this railroad that was going to provide a transcontinental line through the far northern section of the country, he basically funded construction with loans and speculative investment strategies, tying in a number of major financial institutions, major banks, other major companies to the success of the Northern Pacific. So, all these loans depended on the Northern Pacific being successful. But what happened? Well, as the construction project drags on and on and on, and they keep encountering hurdles, September 1873, the Northern Pacific Railroad collapsed. And in the process, it took other institutions with it. And so within 2 years, 18,000 businesses had failed, hundreds of banks had failed, 89 railroad companies failed. And this economic catastrophe quickly spread to Europe because at this time period, a lot of European banks and investors and aristocrats were investing in this, in the heyday of American industrialization. So it spreads, and then next thing you know, European countries start experiencing economic problems. And what basically happens is from 1873 up through 1893, there's just going to be wave after wave, 3 major recessions that are just going to sweep through industrialized countries. So, today when we say Great Depression in the United States, we think, 1829 to World War II. Say Great Depression in European countries, well, they think actually like, 1873, 1893, as their first major time period to experience this. But in our history books, we usually overlook this panic, although it was a very, very, very significant economic event of its time period. Now, 1877, Reconstruction came to an end with the Hayes-Tilden election, the Hayes-Tilden presidential contest. At this point, again, support for Reconstruction had greatly waned. People were tired of constantly having to fight Southern states and making them, support the right or recognize the rights of African Americans. They were tired of constantly having to police Southern states to keep the violence from renewing. It required a constant federal presence to keep the Southern states from basically trying to bring a lot of these former Confederate leaders back in and trying the things that they did under the Johnson administration. So when the election occurred, and you add to that, of course, Panic of 1873, you add to that corruption scandals. The Democrats, they were on the rise in the North, but they were also, regaining some power and some traction in the Southern states. So what happened was in this election, it came down to 3 states, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. And there were charges of fraud and voter intimidation that threw their electoral returns into dispute. So you have 2 guys here. And what did you need? Well, you needed this magic number. Oh, sorry, not that one. You needed this magic number right here. Well, down here, this is the Democratic poster. And so here's Tilden, this guy right here. He only needed 1 more. He just needs 1 more electoral vote. And then here's Hayes right here. What does he need? He needs 19 more electoral votes, and that's without these three states. So basically, Tilden just needed 1. Any one of these would do. Hayes, on the other hand, he needed all 3. So, it ends up in a big debate, and the issue ends up going to the House of Representatives. And in the House of Representatives, while they're determining the winner, a negotiation begins and a deal is struck. Basically, Hayes is going to get the election. But in return for a Hayes victory, the Republicans had to promise some things. First, federal funding for Southern railroads and industry. Although the Southern states and the Southern population initially, resisted a lot of these economic and social changes, by the 1877, they were starting to recognize, hey, if we have railroads and we have industry, we have prosperity, and this may not be a bad thing for us. So yeah, now they want federal funding for that. Two, they wanted the withdrawal of all troops from their country. That's right, not their country, their states. Three, the southern states would promise fair treatment of African Americans, but they would be the ones to guarantee it. So, in other words, what they're saying is, okay, we'll promise you, but the execution's not going to necessarily, we're going to do it our way. And then finally, the Republicans had to agree that one Southerner would be appointed to the cabinet. So in the end, with the exhaustion over Reconstruction looming, what happens? Well, the Republicans, they basically made a deal in which they exchanged control of the nation for African-American freedoms in the South. So basically what will happen from this point on? Well, Hayes will go on. He will be the next president. The Republicans will continue to exercise a lot of control in national politics from this point on. But as of this point, Reconstruction officially ends. And following 1877, this is going to be the time period of what's known as Jim Crow, the era of segregated Southern society. This is going to be the time period that's going to be, marked by Plessy versus Ferguson and the separate but equal doctrine. It's going to see the revival of the Ku Klux Klan in the early 1900s with its, full revival by the 1920s. So, kind of an event that when we look back at it, it brings about an end to a time period of a lot of conflict. It will start to see a quieting of sectional disputes. The American country will have been transformed, with the federal government having a larger role to play, not a massive one, but a little larger role. Industry will finally have taken off. The country will be united across lines, but the people that will end up paying for it will be the African Americans of the southern states, the Native Americans of the Great Plains, and the generations to come that will have to struggle with the legacy of the Compromise of 1877.